Under the rain soaking her torn clothes, a lone woman faces the unknown, but what awaits her beyond the gate no one dares to imagine. The wind howled through the pines that October night in rural Mississippi, rattling the tin roof of the old Methodist church and sending dead leaves spiraling across the dirt road like lost prayers. Sarah May Whitfield pressed her back against the weathered oak behind the abandoned general store, her thin shawl doing little to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The voices from Murphy's tavern carried on the wind, her father's drunken words cutting through the darkness like a rusty blade. "That barren girl ain't no daughter of mine," Thomas Whitfield's voice slurred and cracked as he held court with the other farmers. 26 years old and dry as a summer creek. What good's a woman who can't birth babies? Might as well be dead to me. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's keep going. Sarah May closed her eyes, feeling each word settle like stones in her chest. She'd heard it all before, but tonight something in his tone felt final, like the closing of a coffin lid. The doctor in Jackson had confirmed what she'd feared for years after her marriage to young Henry Carlisle had produced nothing but heartache and empty cradles. Henry had left for Memphis 3 months after the news, taking his family's approval and her last shred of hope with him. The screen door of Murphy's slammed open, and Sarah May shrank deeper into the shadows as her father stumbled out, supported by 2 men she recognized from the cotton mill. Behind them, old Pete Morrison's gravelly voice carried a warning that made her blood turn cold. "You best be careful, Thomas. That daughter of yours been seen talking to them freedmen families down by Possum Creek. Folks are saying she's been giving them food from your pantry." Thomas spat into the dirt, the sound sharp and dismissive. "She ain't my concern no more. Come morning, she can find herself another roof. I got my reputation to think about." Sarah May's heart hammered against her ribs as the men's voices faded down the road. She'd indeed been sharing what little food she could with the former slave families who'd settled in the bottomland near Possum Creek, their makeshift cabins barely standing against the elements. It wasn't charity that drove her, but something deeper, a recognition of shared exile that she couldn't quite name. The first drops of rain began to fall as she gathered her few possessions. A worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, a photograph of herself as a child, and the quilt her grandmother had stitched with trembling fingers in her final years. Everything else belonged to a life that no longer wanted her. By dawn, Thomas Whitfield had made good on his promise. Sarah May found her belongings scattered in the yard like refuse, and the door to the only home she'd ever known barred against her. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins from the neighboring farm watched from her kitchen window, her face a mixture of pity and relief that such misfortune had passed her by. "You can't stay here, child," Mrs. Hutchins called from her porch, wrapping her housecoat tighter against the morning chill. "Thomas is drinking again, and when he drinks he gets ideas about what needs fixing. You'd best find somewhere else to light." Sarah May nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. Her father's rages were legendary in Millfield County, and his shame about her barrenness had been festering like an infected wound. She gathered her scattered belongings, feeling the weight of curious eyes from every window in town. The first place she sought refuge was at the Carlisle farm, hoping Henry's parents might show mercy for their former daughter-in-law. But Martha Carlisle met her at the gate with cold eyes and a firm shake of her head. "You got no business here, Sarah May. Henry's moved on, like he should have done years ago. We got no room for damaged goods." The rejection cut deep, but not as deep as the realization that she'd become something to be discarded, a broken tool that no longer served its purpose. She walked the dirt roads between farms, asking for work, for shelter, for any small kindness that might sustain her. Door after door closed, some with apologetic smiles, others with barely concealed disgust. At the Henderson place, where she'd helped with the harvest for 3 years running, Jim Henderson couldn't meet her eyes as he turned her away. "It ain't," personal, Sarah May, but the wife's been talking to the church ladies and they think maybe God's marking you for something. Maybe it's best you find your way somewhere else. The weight of judgment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. In a community where a woman's worth was measured by the children she could bear, Sarah May had become living proof of divine displeasure, a walking reminder of failure that made others uncomfortable. As the sun reached its peak, she found herself at the edge of town, standing before the ramshackle cabins where the freedmen families had built their small community. The children playing in the dust looked up at her with curious eyes, their laughter dying as they sensed something broken in her posture. An elderly woman emerged from the largest cabin, her grey hair wrapped in a faded blue headscarf. This was Mama Ruth, the informal leader of the settlement, a woman whose presence commanded respect even from those who refused to acknowledge her humanity. "Child, you look like you carrying the weight of the world," Mama Ruth said, her voice gentle but wary. "What brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" Sarah May's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I got nowhere else to go, Mom. My daddy, he don't want me anymore." Mama Ruth studied her for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to see straight through to Sarah May's soul. Behind her, other faces appeared in doorways, watching the white woman who'd been kind to them now standing at their threshold like a beggar. "Honey, you know what happens when white folks come looking for trouble in our direction. We can't afford to take in strays, no matter how lost they might be." The kindness in Mama Ruth's refusal somehow made it worse than the cruel dismissals she'd received elsewhere. Sarah May nodded, understanding the impossible position her presence created for these people who had even less security than she did. As evening approached, she found herself walking toward the county line, her feet moving. Without conscious direction, the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of singing from the Baptist church, voices raised in harmony that spoke of faith she could no longer claim. The last light of day was fading when she reached the old Sinclair. In place, a farm that had been abandoned since the war took both Sinclair boys and left their parents too broken to continue. The house stood empty, its windows dark and welcoming as any grave. Sarah May settled on the sagging porch, pulling her grandmother's quilt around her shoulders as the first stars appeared overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, its lonely song echoing across the cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like a sea of broken dreams. She thought about her mother, who died when Sarah May was barely 12, taking with her all the gentle wisdom that might have made this burden easier to bear. Her mother had been barren for 8 years before Sarah May's birth, and perhaps that's why she'd understood something about worth that others seemed to miss. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of horses on the road and voices that made Sarah May's blood run cold. Her father's voice, rough with whiskey and anger, cut through the night like a saw blade. "She's got to be around here somewhere, can't have gone far on foot." Sarah May pressed herself against the shadows of the porch, her heart hammering as torchlight bobbed closer. Through the darkness, she could make out 3 figures on horseback and the silhouette of her father's familiar slouch in the saddle. The hunt had begun, and there was nowhere left to run. The torchlight danced closer, and Sarah May could hear the heavy breathing of horses that had been ridden hard. Her father's voice carried a note of determination that made her stomach clench with fear. She knew that tone. It was the same one he'd used when putting down their old hound dog after it had gone lame, a practical cruelty that brooked no argument. "Jim says he saw her heading toward the county line," came another voice she recognized as Buck Morrison, old Pete's eldest son. "Could be she's making for the railroad tracks, trying to catch a freight to Memphis." "She ain't smart enough for that," Thomas Whitfield replied, the sound of him spitting tobacco juice punctuating his words. "Girl never had the sense God gave. A goose. She's holed up somewhere close, probably crying her eyes out like she used to do when she was little. Sarah May pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the sob that threatened to give her away. The memory he referenced cut deep. Those nights when she'd hidden in the barn after her mother's death, weeping for a gentleness that would never return. The horses moved past the Sinclair place, their hoofbeats fading into the distance, but Sarah May didn't dare move. She knew her father's methods well enough to understand this might be a feint, a way to flush her out of hiding. She waited until the night sounds returned, the calling of owls and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, before allowing herself to breathe normally. As the hours passed, the cold seeped through. Her grandmother's quilt and Sarah May found herself drifting between wakefulness and exhausted sleep. It was during one of these twilight moments that she heard something that made her blood freeze. The soft whimpering of a child. The sound came from somewhere behind the abandoned house, near where the old well stood covered by rotting boards. Sarah May crept carefully around the building, her bare feet silent on the packed earth, following the sound of muffled crying. In the pale moonlight, she could make out a small figure huddled against the wellhead. A boy who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, his clothes torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and mud. "Hey there," Sarah May whispered, keeping her voice gentle as she approached. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The boy looked up with eyes wide with fear, and Sarah May's heart clenched at the terror she saw there. His lip was split, and there was a bruise forming along his left cheek that spoke of recent violence. "Don't hurt me," he stammered, trying to scramble away despite his obvious exhaustion. "I'll go back, I promise. Just don't hit me no more." Sarah May stopped moving, holding her hands where he could see them. "Nobody's going to hurt you, child. I promise. What's your name?" The boy studied her face in the moonlight, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Billy Crawford." The name meant nothing to Sarah May, but something in the boy's manner suggested he was running from something far worse than her own troubles. She could see now that what she'd taken for dirt on his clothes was actually dried blood, and the way he favored his left side suggested injuries she couldn't see. "Billy, are you hurt? Do you need help?" Before the boy could answer, the sound of approaching horses came again, this time from a different direction, but these weren't the heavy, deliberate hoofbeats of her father's search party. These horses moved with purpose, but without anger, and she could hear the soft murmur of voices that carried concern rather than threat. "Billy? Billy Crawford?" A man's voice called through the darkness, deep and steady, with just a note of worry threading through it. "Son, if you can hear me, you need to come out. Your sisters are scared sick about you." The boy's entire body went rigid at the sound of the voice, but not with fear, with something that looked almost like hope. He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, and cupped his hands around his mouth. Pa, I'm here." The response was immediate. 3 horses burst into the clearing around the Sinclair place, their riders dismounting almost before the animals came to a full stop. In the lead was a tall man with broad shoulders and work-hardened hands, his dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples. Behind him came 2 figures that Sarah May realized were older children, a girl of perhaps 14 and a boy who might have been 16. "Billy," the man's voice cracked with relief as he swept the boy into his arms, seemingly unconcerned with the blood and dirt that transferred to his own shirt. "Son, what happened? Where have you been?" As Billy buried his face in his father's shoulder, the older children moved closer, and Sarah May could see the family resemblance in their features. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to their jaws. "Pa, Mr. Hutchison came looking for Billy again," the girl said, her voice tight with anger. "He said Billy owed him for that chicken that got loose, said he was going to teach him about respecting other folks' property." The man's face went dark with a fury that made Sarah May instinctively step back into the shadows. Ben Hutchison laid, "No hands on my boy. He had his switch," Billy mumbled against his father's shirt. "Said I was gonna learn the lesson my pa should have taught me about stealing. But I didn't steal nothing, Pa. That old chicken just got out of its pen." Sarah May watched this family reunion with a mixture of longing and fear. The love between them was so tangible it seemed to fill the air around them, but she also recognized the dangerous ground they stood on. In rural Mississippi, a man like Ben Hutchison, who owned 300 acres and sat on the county board, could make life hell for a family that crossed him. The older boy, who shared his father's height and steady manner, glanced around the clearing and spotted Sarah May's figure in the shadows. "Pa, there's someone else here." The man looked up, his arms still protective around Billy, and his eyes found Sarah May where she stood frozen by the side of the abandoned house. For a moment, nobody moved, and Sarah May felt the weight of judgment she'd grown accustomed to settling over her like a familiar burden. But this man's gaze was different. Where others had looked at her with pity, disgust, or calculation, he simply looked at her with the calm assessment of someone trying to understand a situation before acting. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice respectful but cautious, "I'm sorry if we disturbed you. We were just looking for my boy here." Sarah May found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "He's hurt. The boy is hurt." The man's attention sharpened, and he gently turned Billy so he could see his face in the moonlight. The bruises were clearer now, and Sarah May heard the sharp intake of breath from the older. "Children, that son of a—" the man began, then caught himself glancing at the children. "Ben Hutchison's going to answer for this." "No, Pa," Billy said quickly, his voice urgent with fear. "He said if I told, he'd come for the girls next. He said he'd find a reason to take Mary Catherine and Clara May away, said he had friends who'd believe whatever he told them." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that Sarah May understood all too well. In a place where power was concentrated in the hands of men like Ben Hutchison, threats like that weren't idle talk. They were promises backed by a system that protected those who owned the land and ignored those who merely lived on it. The man's jaw worked as he processed this information, and Sarah May could see him calculating odds and consequences with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous waters. "We'll figure this out," he said finally, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "But first, let's get you home and looked after." As he helped Billy back onto one of the horses, his eyes found Sarah May again. She braced herself for the questions that were bound to come, the demands to know what a woman like her was doing in a place like this at this time of night. Instead, he simply said, "Mom, it's not safe out here. These aren't the kind of roads a person should be walking alone, especially after dark." The kindness in his voice was unexpected, and Sarah May felt tears threatening again. She managed a nod, not trusting herself to speak. As the family prepared to leave, the older girl, Mary Catherine, Sarah May remembered, looked back at her with something that might have been understanding. It was a look that suggested she knew something about being vulnerable in a world that didn't much care about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The man paused as he mounted his horse, Billy secure in front of him. "There's a cabin about 2 miles south of here near Miller's Creek. Old place, but the roof's sound, and there's a well that runs clean. If you're looking for somewhere to shelter, you might consider it." Before Sarah May could ask why he was helping a stranger, the family was gone, their horses carrying them back into the darkness toward whatever home awaited them. Left alone again in the shadow of the abandoned house, Sarah May felt something shift inside her chest. A loosening of the tight knot of despair that had been growing there since her father's rejection. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her with basic human decency, had offered help without expecting anything in return. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of her father's search party, still hunting through the night. But now Sarah May had a destination, a place to aim for that might offer more than just temporary shelter. As she gathered her few possessions and started walking south toward Miller's Creek, she carried with her the memory of a man who'd treated her like a person worth protecting, and the hope that perhaps not everyone in the world had closed their doors against her. The cabin sat in a grove of sweet gum trees near Miller's Creek, just as the man had described. In the pale light of dawn, Sarah May could see that while the structure was weathered and worn, it had been built to last. The roof showed signs of recent repair, and someone had cleared the worst of the undergrowth from around the foundation. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney, and Sarah May's heart sank as she realized the place wasn't as abandoned as she'd hoped. As she hesitated at the edge of the clearing, the door opened, and the same man from the night before emerged, carrying a bucket toward the creek. He moved with the easy efficiency of someone accustomed to early mornings and hard work, and Sarah May noticed that his clothes, while patched and worn, were clean and carefully mended. He looked up and saw her standing there, and his face showed no surprise, as if he'd been expecting her arrival. "Morning, ma'am," he called, setting down his bucket. "I was wondering if you'd make it this far." Sarah May found her voice, though it came out rusty from the cold night. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here. I'll move on." "No need for that," he said, straightening to his full height. "There's room enough, and it looks like you could use somewhere to rest." He gestured toward the cabin. "Coffee's on, if you're interested." The offer of warmth and coffee was almost too tempting to resist, but Sarah May had learned to be wary of kindness that came too easily. "I don't want to be a burden. I can pay my way if you'll let me stay. I'm good with mending and cooking, and I can help with the children." Something in his expression shifted at the mention of payment, and Sarah May realized she'd said something that mattered to him. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than she intended to show. "Name's Jacob Crawford," he said finally, "and I'm not looking for hired help. But if you're looking for a place to catch your breath and figure out your next move, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." The name Crawford clicked in Sarah May's memory. This was Billy's father, the man who'd been searching for his hurt boy in the darkness. Up close, in the morning light, she could see the worry lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders carried the weight of responsibility for his children. "I'm Sarah May," she said, then hesitated before adding, "Sarah May Whitfield." If the name meant anything to him, Jacob Crawford didn't show it. He simply nodded and picked up his bucket again. "Well, Sarah May Whitfield, the coffee's getting stronger by the minute, and Billy's been asking about the lady who helped him last night." Inside the cabin, Sarah May found a space that was clean and organized despite its obvious poverty. The furniture was simple but well made, and every surface showed the care of someone who took pride in their home, regardless of its circumstances. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of cornbread baking filled the air with warmth and comfort. Billy sat at a rough wooden table, his bruised face more visible in the lamplight. Beside him, two girls worked on what appeared to be schoolwork, their dark heads bent over slates covered with careful handwriting. They looked up as Sarah May entered, and she saw the same wariness in their eyes that she'd grown accustomed to, seeing everywhere she went. "This is Mary Catherine," Jacob said, indicating the older girl, "and Clara May. You met Billy last night, and my oldest Daniel is out checking the snares." The girls offered polite nods, but kept their distance, and Sarah May understood their caution. They'd learned, as she had, that strangers often brought trouble in their wake. Jacob poured coffee into a chipped but clean cup and handed it to Sarah May. The liquid was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, and she felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "How's Billy this morning?" she asked, looking at the boy with concern. "Sore," Billy admitted, But Pa says the bruises will fade. It's not the first time Mr. Hutchison got mad about something. Jacob's jaw tightened at his son's words, and Sarah May saw his hands clench briefly before he forced them to relax. "Billy, why don't you show Miss Sarah May where she can wash up? There's a basin on the back porch and the water's clean." As Billy led her outside, Sarah May caught a glimpse of the tension that ran through this family like an electric current. They were afraid, she realized, not just of Ben Hutchison, but of the precarious position they occupied in a world that could turn hostile without warning. The back porch overlooked Miller's Creek, where Daniel Crawford was returning from his morning hunt. At 16, he was already nearly as tall as his father. With the same steady manner and careful eyes, he carried 2 rabbits and a possum, evidence of a successful morning. "Pa says you're staying for a while," Daniel said to Sarah May, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "That's good. Billy's been worried about you, wondering if you found somewhere safe." The simple kindness in his words brought tears to Sarah May's eyes, and she had to turn away to compose herself. It had been so long since anyone had worried about her safety that she'd forgotten what such concern felt like. Over the next few hours, Sarah May began to understand the rhythm of life in the Crawford household. Jacob worked as a sharecropper on several different farms, taking whatever jobs he could find to keep his family fed and housed. The children helped where they could, Daniel with the hunting and heavier work, Mary Catherine with the cooking and household management, and even little Billy and Clara May had their chores. It was a hard life, but there was love in it that filled the spaces between worry and want. Sarah May watched Jacob help Clara May with her letters, saw Mary Catherine automatically cut her portion of cornbread in half to make sure Billy had enough, witnessed Daniel teaching his little brother how to tie fishing knots with endless patience. This was what she'd always dreamed of, not just children of her own, but a family bound together by choice and care rather than mere biology. Watching them, she felt the old ache of longing mixed with something new, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. By midday, Ben Hutchison arrived. Sarah May heard the horses first, the sound of multiple riders approaching with authority rather than caution. Through the cabin's single window, she could see 3 men on horseback, their clothes marking them as men of substance in the community. Hutchison himself was a large man with graying hair and small, calculating eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they saw. "Crawford!" Hutchison's voice boomed across the clearing, carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're in there. We need to have ourselves a conversation." Jacob emerged from the cabin, his movements deliberate and calm, but Sarah May could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. Daniel flanked him, and Mary Catherine quietly ushered the younger children toward the back of the cabin. "Mr. Hutchison," Jacob said, his voice level but lacking any warmth, "what can I do for you?" "You can start by teaching that boy of yours some respect for other people's property," Hutchison replied, dismounting from his horse. "That chicken that got loose yesterday cost me 3 others. They scattered when the pen broke, and I spent half the night chasing them down. The boy owes me for the trouble, and I intend to collect." Sarah May felt her hands clench into fists as she realized what was happening. Hutchison wasn't here about chickens. He was here to establish dominance, to make sure Jacob knew who held power in this county. "Billy's just a child," Jacob said carefully. "If there was damage done, I'll make it right, but there's no call to lay hands on him the way you did." Hutchison's face darkened at the implied criticism. "You questioning my methods, Crawford? Because I got to tell you, I'm getting mighty tired of your family's attitude. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to make your living." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a brush fire, and Sarah May understood with crystal clarity that this man could destroy the Crawford family with a few words to the right people. Sharecroppers had no rights that landowners were bound to respect, and Ben Hutchison had the connections to make sure Jacob never found work in 3 counties. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the danger. "I just want to raise my children in peace." "Peace is something you earn," Hutchison replied, remounting his horse. "And right now, your account's running short. You think about that, Crawford. Think real hard." As the men rode away, Sarah May watched Jacob's shoulders sag slightly, as if he'd been holding his breath and could finally release it. But she could see that nothing had been resolved. If anything, the situation had gotten worse. That evening, as the family gathered around the table for their simple supper, Sarah May made a decision that would change everything. She'd spent her whole life being told she was worthless because she couldn't bear children. But sitting here with these children who needed protection, she realized that motherhood might have less to do with biology than she'd ever imagined. Nutty question was whether she had the courage to claim it. The decision came to Sarah May in the middle of the night when Clara May's fevered crying pulled her from restless sleep. Jacob was already up, pacing the small cabin with his youngest daughter in his arms, her small body burning with illness that had come on suddenly after supper. "She's so hot," Mary Catherine whispered, her 14-year-old voice tight with worry as she pressed a damp cloth to her sister's forehead. "Pa, what if it's the lung fever? What if she's dying?" Sarah May saw the terror in Jacob's eyes, the helpless fear of a parent who'd already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose more. She'd heard the story from Billy earlier that day, how their mother, Elizabeth, had died of consumption 2 years ago, leaving Jacob to raise 4 children alone in a world that offered no safety net for families like theirs. "Let me try," Sarah May said quietly, moving toward them. "My mother used to say I had a gift with sick children." Jacob hesitated for only a moment before placing Clara May in Sarah May's arms. The child was small for her age, all sharp angles and delicate features, and her dark hair was damp with sweat. But when Sarah May began to rock her gently, humming a half-remembered lullaby her own mother had sung, Clara May's crying softened to whimpers. "There's willow bark in the woods by the creek," Sarah May said, her voice low so as not to disturb the child. "And wild mint growing near the water. If we make a tea, it might help bring the fever down." Daniel, who'd been standing silently in the corner, immediately headed for the door. "I'll get them. Tell me what they look like." As the night wore on, Sarah May found herself naturally taking charge of Clara May's care. She made the willow bark tea, coaxed small sips past the child's cracked lips, and sang soft songs that seemed to ease the little girl's restless tossing. By dawn, the fever had broken, and Clara May was sleeping peacefully in Sarah May's arms. "Thank you," Jacob said simply, but Sarah May could hear the depth of gratitude in those 2 words. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "You would have figured it out," Sarah May replied, gently transferring the sleeping child to her own bed. "You're a good father, Jacob Crawford. These children are lucky to have you." Something shifted in Jacob's expression at her words, a softening around his eyes that told her the compliment had hit home. It occurred to her that he probably didn't hear such things very often. Men like him were expected to shoulder their burdens without praise or recognition. Over the following days, Sarah May found herself settling into the rhythm of the Crawford household with surprising ease. She helped Mary Catherine with the cooking and mending, taught Billy his letters when Jacob was away working, and listened to Clara May's endless chatter about everything and nothing. Daniel, initially suspicious of this strange woman who'd appeared in their lives, gradually warmed to her as he saw how naturally she fit into their family dynamic. But even as Sarah May began to feel something like belonging for the first time in years, the shadow of Ben Hutchison continued to loom over them all. Word came through the local network of sharecroppers and tenant farmers that Hutchison was making inquiries about Jacob, asking questions about his character and reliability. The message was clear. Jacob's time in Millfield County was running short. It was Mary Catherine who first voiced what they were all thinking. "Pa, maybe we should just leave," she said one evening as they sat around the table after supper. "Truby, pack up and head north, like the Jenkinsons did last spring. Find somewhere Mr. Hutchison can't reach us." Jacob's jaw tightened at the suggestion. "This is our home, Mary Catherine. Your mama's buried in the churchyard not 5 miles from here. I won't have her resting place tended by strangers." "But if we stay, what happens to us?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone forced to think like an adult before his time. "You know what Hutchison's planning. He wants us gone, and he's got the power to make it happen." Sarah May listened to this conversation with a growing sense of determination. She'd spent her entire life being pushed around by men who thought they owned the right to decide her worth, her place, her future. The idea of watching the same thing happen to this family, these children who'd shown her more kindness in a week than she'd received in years, made something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. "What if there was another way?" she said quietly. 4 pairs of eyes turned to her, and Sarah May felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. She'd been thinking about this for days, turning the idea over in her mind, examining it from every angle. "I've been talking to folks in town," she continued, keeping her voice steady. "Asking questions, listening to gossip. Ben Hutchison's got debts of his own, big ones. The bank in Jackson's been asking hard questions about his cotton crop, and there's talk that he owes more than he can pay." Jacob frowned. "What are you getting at, Sarah May?" "I'm getting at the fact that men like Hutchison only have power as long as folks believe they do. But if someone was to challenge him, to stand up and say no loud enough for people to hear." She paused, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "Sometimes bullies back down when they realize they're not the only ones with something to lose." "You're talking about fighting him," Daniel said, and Sarah May could hear both admiration and fear in his voice. "Taking him on directly." "I'm talking about protecting this family," Sarah May replied. "About making sure these children have a home and a future that no one can take away from them." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and danger. Sarah May could see Jacob wrestling with the idea, torn between his desire to protect his children and his understanding of just how powerful Ben Hutchison really was. It was Billy who broke the silence, his young voice carrying a clarity that startled them all. "Miss Sarah May's right, Pa. We can't keep running from folks like Mr. Hutchison. If we don't stand up now, we'll just have to keep running forever." Mary Catherine nodded slowly. "And there's others who'd stand with us if they thought they had a chance. The Washingtons down by the river, the Thompson family, they're all scared of Hutchison too." Jacob looked around the table at his children, and Sarah May could see him struggling with a decision that could change everything. Finally, he turned to her, his dark eyes serious. "What exactly are you proposing, Sarah May?" She took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke the words aloud, there would be no taking them back. "I'm proposing that we make Hutchison an offer he can't refuse. See, I know something about him that he doesn't think anyone knows, about where he gets his money when the crops fail, about why he's so eager to drive families like yours off their land." The room went completely still, and Sarah May could feel the electricity of shared purpose beginning to build among them. "My father used to drink with Hutchison's men," she continued. "I heard things, saw things. Hutchison's been buying up land from desperate families for next to nothing, then selling it to the railroad for 10 times what he paid. But he's been falsifying the deeds, claiming ownership of property that doesn't belong to him." Jacob's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You're talking about fraud, about crimes that could put him in federal prison." "I'm talking about justice," Sarah May said firmly, "and about making sure he never hurts another family the way he's hurt yours." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. But inside the cabin, something new was taking shape. a sense of purpose that bound them together, stronger than blood, stronger than law, stronger than the fear that had governed their lives for too long. For the first time since her mother's death, Sarah May felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had people worth fighting for and a cause worth the risk. Looking around the table at these faces that had become so dear to her, she realized that family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you chose, something you fought for, something you protected with everything you had. The question now was whether they had the courage to see it through. The plan came together over 3 days of careful preparation, with Sarah May at the center of it all, like the hub of a wheel. She'd never felt so alive, so certain of her purpose, as she did while organizing what would either be their salvation or their destruction. The key, she'd realized, was Sheriff Tom Bradley. Unlike many of the county officials who owed their positions to men like Ben Hutchison, Bradley had earned his badge through years of honest service and had a reputation for fairness that crossed racial and economic lines. More importantly, he'd been asking his own questions about the sudden surge in land sales to the railroad company. Sarah May found him at Murphy's Tavern on a Thursday evening, nursing a cup of coffee and reading through a stack of legal documents. By lamplight, she'd spent considerable time preparing for this conversation, knowing she'd only get one chance to convince him. "Sheriff Bradley," she said, approaching his table with careful deference, "I'm Sarah May Whitfield. I was wondering if I might have a word with you about some irregularities I've noticed in recent land transactions." Bradley looked up from his papers, his weathered face showing surprise at being approached by a woman he didn't recognize. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and Sarah May could see him taking her measure with the practiced gaze of a lawman. "Miss Whitfield," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "I know that name. Thomas Whitfield's daughter, if I'm not mistaken." "Yes, sir, though my father and I aren't on speaking terms at the moment." Sarah May settled into the chair, her back straight and her voice steady. "What I have to tell you might be of interest to your investigation into certain property transfers." Bradley's eyebrows rose slightly. "What makes you think I'm investigating property transfers?" "Because you're an honest man in a county where honest men are rare," Sarah May replied. "And because I've seen the documents that prove Ben Hutchison's been selling land he doesn't own to the Mississippi Central Railroad." The sheriff's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Whitfield. I hope you have serious evidence to back it up." Sarah May reached into her bag and withdrew a collection of papers she'd painstakingly copied from documents she'd seen in her father's possession. Thomas Whitfield, in his alcoholic haze, had been careless with paperwork that Hutchison had trusted him to handle, never imagining his worthless daughter would understand their significance. "These are copies of 3 different deeds for the same parcel of land down by Possum Creek," she said, spreading them on the table. "The first shows the original ownership by the Henderson family. The second shows Hutchison buying it from them for $50. The third shows him selling it to the railroad for $500. Bradley examined the papers carefully, his trained eye picking out the details that mattered. "These dates don't make sense. According to this, Hutchison sold the land to the railroad 2 weeks before he bought it from the Hendersons." "Yes, sir. And if you check the Henderson place, you'll find they never sold their land to anyone. They were driven off by threats and violence, and Hutchison simply falsified the paperwork after they left." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Miss Whitfield, if what you're saying is true, we're talking about federal crimes. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, charges that could put a man away for decades. I know what we're talking about, Sheriff. The question is whether you're willing to pursue justice against a man with Hutchison's connections." Bradley studied her for a long moment, and Sarah May had the sense he was seeing past her plain dress and uncertain social position to something deeper. "Why are you bringing this to me?" he asked. "What's your stake in this?" Sarah May thought. Of Jacob's worried face when Clara May had been sick, of Billy's bruised cheek, of Mary Catherine cutting her food in half to make sure her siblings had enough. She thought of Daniel teaching his little brother to fish with infinite patience, and of the way they'd all welcomed her into their circle without question or judgment. "My stake is in seeing that good people don't get crushed by bad ones," she said simply. "Ben Hutchison's been using his stolen money to drive honest families off their land, families like the Crawfords, who never did anything but try to make an honest living." "The Crawfords," Bradley repeated thoughtfully. "Jacob Crawford and his children. I heard Hutchison's been pressuring them to leave the county." "More than pressuring, he's threatened to have them blacklisted from every farm in 3 counties unless they disappear. And yesterday, he made it clear that his patience is running out." Bradley gathered up the papers, his movements decisive. "Miss Whitfield, I'm going to need you to swear out a formal complaint, and I'm going to need you to understand that once we start this process, there's no going back. Hutchison has friends in high places, and they won't take kindly to seeing him exposed." "I understand," Sarah May said, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "But some things are worth the risk." 2 days later, the confrontation came to a head in a way none of them had expected. Sarah May was helping Mary Catherine hang laundry when they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. Through the trees, she could see Ben Hutchison leading a group of 6 men, their faces set with grim purpose. "Daniel!" Mary Catherine called, her voice tight with alarm. "Pa! They're coming!" Jacob emerged from the cabin, his shotgun in his hands, but pointed toward the ground. Daniel flanked him, carrying his father's old hunting rifle, while Billy and Clara May disappeared into the cabin as they'd been instructed. "Crawford!" Hutchison's voice boomed across the clearing as he dismounted. "I'm done playing games with you. You and your brats have until sundown to clear out, or I'll have the sheriff remove you for trespassing." "This land belongs to the Sinclair estate," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "We have permission to be here." "The Sinclair estate owes me money," Hutchison shot back. "Money I'm claiming by taking possession of this property. You got no rights here anymore." Sarah May stepped out from behind the clothesline, her chin raised defiantly. "Actually, Mr. Hutchison, you're the one without rights here." Hutchison's face darkened as he recognized her. "Sarah May Whitfield. I should have known Thomas's worthless daughter would turn up in the middle of this mess. What lies have you been spreading about me?" "No lies," Sarah May said, moving to stand beside Jacob. "Just the truth about your business dealings with the railroad company." "You don't know what you're talking about, girl." "I know about the Henderson land. I know about the falsified deeds, and I know Sheriff Bradley is very interested in discussing these matters with you." And as if summoned by her words, the sound of more horses came through the trees. But these carried badges and official authority, Sheriff Bradley and 2 federal marshals, their presence transforming the confrontation from a simple eviction to something far more serious. "Ben Hutchison," Bradley called out as he dismounted, "you're under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The silence that followed was complete, except for the sound of wind through the trees and the creek babbling in the distance. Sarah May watched Hutchison's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation as he realized his world was crumbling around him. "This is a mistake," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I'm a respected member of this community. I sit on the county board." "You're a criminal," one of the federal marshals replied, producing a set of handcuffs, "and you're going to face federal charges for your crimes." As they led Hutchison away, his men melting into the trees like shadows, Sarah May felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of justice served. But more than that, She felt the solid presence of the Crawford family around her, their relief and gratitude forming a circle of warmth that no threat could penetrate. "It's over," Jacob said quietly, though his eyes remained watchful. "He can't hurt us anymore." Sarah May nodded, but she knew that in many ways this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning of the life she'd never dared to dream possible, surrounded by people who valued her, not for what she could produce, but for who she chose to be. As the last of Hutchison's men disappeared into the distance, Clara May emerged from the cabin and slipped her small hand into Sarah May's, as natural as breathing. "Are you going to stay with us now?" the little girl asked, her dark eyes full of hope. Sarah May looked around at the faces that had become her world. Jacob with his quiet strength, Daniel with his steady reliability, Mary Catherine with her fierce protectiveness, Billy with his brave spirit, and Clara May with her boundless trust. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a vow. "I'm going to stay." And for the first time in her life, Sarah May Whitfield knew exactly where she belonged. 3 years later, Sarah May Crawford stood on the porch of the house Jacob had built with his own hands, watching as Daniel taught a group of neighborhood children how to properly plant corn in the rich soil they'd claimed as their own. The Sinclair property had been theirs to purchase at a fair price once Hutchison's fraudulent claims were sorted out, and they'd transformed the abandoned farm into something that buzzed with life and purpose. The house was larger now, with rooms added for the children who'd found their way to them over the months and years that followed Hutchison's arrest. There was Tommy, whose parents had died in a mill accident, and little Susan, abandoned at the church steps with nothing but a note asking for kindness. There was Marcus, a freedman's son who'd been orphaned when night riders burned his family's cabin, and Rebecca, whose unwed mother had died in childbirth, leaving her with nowhere to go. Each child had brought their own story of loss and displacement, but each had also brought something precious to the family that grew around Sarah May and Jacob like a tree, spreading its branches to shelter everyone who needed protection. "Mama Sarah," Clara May called from the garden, using the name that had evolved naturally over the years. "The tomatoes are coming in real good this year. Should I start picking them for canning?" "Not yet, sweetheart," Sarah May replied, her heart swelling with pride at the girl who'd grown into a capable 12-year-old. "Let them get a little more color first. We want them perfect for the church social next week." The church social had become one of Sarah May's greatest accomplishments, a monthly gathering where families from all over the county came together to share food, stories, and mutual support. It had started small, just a few families who'd been helped by the Crawfords in various ways, but it had grown into something remarkable, a community that crossed the traditional lines of race, religion, and economic status. Pastor Williams, an elderly black minister who'd become Sarah May's closest friend and advisor, often said that what they'd built at the Crawford place was what heaven must look like, a place where love mattered more than bloodlines, where children were valued regardless of where they came from, where everyone had a seat at the table. "Miss Sarah May," came a voice from the road, and Sarah May turned to see Mary Catherine approaching with her own infant, son strapped to her chest. At 17, Mary Catherine had married young Daniel Thompson from the neighboring county, and they'd built their own cabin just a quarter-mile down the creek. But she still came by daily to help with the younger children and to contribute to the growing community that had become known throughout Mississippi as a place of refuge and hope. "How's little Jacob doing today?" Sarah May asked, reaching out to stroke the baby's soft cheek. Named for his grandfather, the child represented something profound, the continuation of a family that had almost been destroyed, now growing strong and secure. "He's perfect," Mary Catherine said, with the glowing pride of a new mother. "Daniel's teaching him to sleep through the night already, says a farmer's got to learn early to work with the sun." They laughed together, the easy laughter of women who'd weathered storms and found joy on the other side. Sarah May often marveled at how different her life had become from what she'd once imagined. She'd thought happiness meant bearing children of her own blood, but instead she discovered that love multiplied when shared, that motherhood was about nurturing rather than birthing, that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. Billy, now 14 and taller than his stepmother, came running from the creek with his fishing pole and a string of bass that would make a fine supper for the dozen people who'd gather around their table that evening. "Mama." "Sarah!" he called out, his face bright with excitement. "I caught enough for everyone, and Marcus says he knows how to smoke them so they'll keep for winter." The title of Mama Sarah had evolved naturally, a way for the children to distinguish between the mother they remembered and the mother they'd found. Sarah May had never asked for it, never demanded it, but when Clara May had first used it during a fever dream 2 years ago, it had stuck like honey to a biscuit. Jacob appeared from the workshop he'd built behind the house, wood shavings in his hair and satisfaction on his face. At 42, he'd grown into his role as patriarch of their unusual family with the same steady reliability he brought to everything else. He'd married Sarah May in a simple ceremony at Pastor William's church, with all their children standing, as witnesses to vows that were more about commitment to community than romantic passion. It wasn't the love of fairy tales, but it was something deeper and more enduring, a partnership built on shared values, mutual respect, and the profound satisfaction of building something meaningful together. "How'd the morning go?" Sarah May asked, slipping her arm through his as they watched their children playing in the yard. "Good." Sheriff Bradley stopped by. He wanted to let us know that Hutchison's appeals have been exhausted. He'll be serving the full 10 years in federal prison, and his property is being sold to pay back the families he defrauded. Sarah May nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She took no joy in any person's downfall, but she couldn't regret the justice that had been served. Hutchison's removal had opened space for good people to thrive, and the evidence was all around her. "There's something else," Jacob continued, his voice carrying a note of excitement. "Bradley says there's talk in Jackson about establishing an official program for children without families. Something based on what we've been doing here. They want to send a representative to study our methods." The idea filled Sarah May with a mixture of pride and amazement. What had started as one woman's desperate search for belonging had grown into something that might change lives across the state. She thought about all the children who were still out there, waiting for someone to see their worth, to offer them the security of unconditional love. As evening approached, the extended family gathered for supper as they did every night. The table Jacob had built was long enough to accommodate everyone, from baby Jacob in his mother's arms to Daniel, who'd grown into a fine young man preparing to start his own family. They joined hands for grace, a tradition that honored Pastor William's influence and their gratitude for abundance that went far beyond material prosperity. "Lord," Jacob said, his voice steady and warm, "we thank you for this food, for this family, and for the reminder that love multiplies when it's shared. Help us to continue being a refuge for those who need one, and a reminder that family is built on choice as much as circumstance." "Amen," they said together, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of unity forged through trials and strengthened by time. After supper, as the children scattered to their evening chores and the adults settled on the porch to watch the sun set over the fields they'd worked together, Sarah May reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started out believing her worth was tied to her ability to bear children, had been rejected and cast out for failing to meet that impossible standard. But sitting here, surrounded by the laughter of children who called her mother, the respect of a community that valued her wisdom, and the solid presence of a partner who'd chosen to build a life with her, she understood that her true purpose had been waiting all along. It hadn't been about creating life, but about nurturing it. Not about blood relations, but about chosen connections. Not about what society said she should be, but about who she decided to become. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that had watched over her during those desperate nights when she'd believed herself worthless and unwanted. Now they seemed to shine with approval on the community that had grown around a simple truth, that love, properly tended, could transform the most unlikely places into home. As the children were tucked into beds in rooms that rang with whispered prayers and gentle lullabies, Sarah May understood that this was her legacy. Not the bloodline she'd never created, but the family she'd chosen, the community she'd helped build, the proof that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to claim it. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out over land that belonged to them now, she thought about other women like her. The rejected, the displaced, the ones society had written off as worthless. She thought about the power of second chances, of communities built on inclusion rather than exclusion, of families defined by love rather than biology. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more children to tend, more ways to serve the community that had become her life's work. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet breathing of those she'd been privileged to love and protect, Sarah May Crawford knew that her story had become exactly what it was meant to be. And perhaps, she thought as sleep began to claim her, that's the most powerful story of all. The one that reminds us that worth isn't determined by what we produce, but by how we choose to love. The story that shows us family isn't about blood, but about the willingness to stand by each other through whatever storms may come. The story that proves home isn't a place you're born into, but a space you create with your own hands, your own heart, your own courage to believe that everyone deserves to belong somewhere. Like the roots of the oak tree that sheltered their house, their love had grown deep and strong, creating a foundation that would sustain generations yet to come. And in that legacy of chosen love, Sarah May had found not just her own redemption, but a blueprint for how the world might be transformed. One heart, one family, one act of courage at a time. If this story has touched your heart the way it has mine, I hope you'll take a moment to share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope and belonging. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply remind each other that our worth isn't determined by society's narrow definitions, but by our capacity to love and be loved in return. Your support in sharing these stories helps them reach the hearts that need them most.